To practice on paper, you're going to want to cut out the paper sample, and you're going to cut with, make sure you're using paper scissors, not your good sewing shears for fabric. But you're going to be cutting on the solid line. There's two pieces that you're going to be cutting out. This one that I'm cutting right now is the outer curve practice. And so you'll want to put your name on it, put your tray number, and you'll keep that. And then you'll want to cut this one out. Do the same thing. So you're going to keep two of these papers that have the line blank for your name. Both of them you're cutting on the solid line. Okay, so you'll keep this one also. And then this piece right here is trash. You can throw that away. The paper practice is designed to help you learn how to sew on a curve. So we're not going to have any thread in the machine. I've taken all my thread out and no bobbin. We're just practicing just with a needle first, just to practice sewing on this line. Now I've got mine set up at an interesting angle just so the camera can see it, but I'm going to try to line my needle up with the dotted line. Then I'm going to lower my presser foot. I'm on a stitch 1 and a stitch length of 2.5. But what I might do as I start along is actually I might change my stitch length a little bit, make it shorter. I've got my machine up pretty high, close to the 3. I'm going to turn it down a little. Okay, and I don't, for this practice, I don't need to backstitch. When you actually start, you will backstitch wherever you start and wherever you stop, because that will be the opening of your pillow to turn it inside out, and you definitely want to backstitch there, but for this practice you don't have to. Alright, so you'll be sewing along on the dotted line. So you'll just be sewing along on the dotted line. And as you get to an area that is curved, you have to guide the paper or the fabric through. Otherwise, it will just keep wanting to go straight, but you're not sewing straight, you're sewing on a curve. So I'm actually just gently applying pressure to the paper to try to guide it through. I'm going really slowly and I'm watching the needle. It's going up and down in the line. What happens though sometimes is as you sew along, especially if you're inexperienced with it, it starts to get off track. So another thing that you can do besides just slowing down and going really slow is lowering your stitch length. So now you may not be able to see my monitor, but I went down from a 2.5 to a 2.0 stitch length. Maybe I go down to a 1.8. So I've just decreased the size of my stitch length, and that makes it a little bit easier when you're going around the curves to maneuver it, because each stitch is going to be shorter than the previous one, so it helps you just kind of go in this nice tight curve. So now we've got a pretty straight area. I could go back and increase my stitch length. Now I'm back up to a 2.0. I could increase my speed slightly for this area because I'm going straight. But then as I approach another curve, again, I'm going to need to maybe slow down just a little bit, reduce my stitch length. So I went back down to a 1.8 stitch length, and I go nice and slow, curving it. I'm even taking my foot off the pedal just to have complete control over what I am doing, because this is the tightest curve right here at the top. So just one little stitch at a time, and I'm using my fingers to rotate the fabric around. Okay, I got a little bit offline right then. What I'm going to do now, my needle's down, I'm going to lift my presser foot. That's just going to help me get on line just a little bit easier by lifting my presser foot, almost pivoting it. Okay, there we go. I stayed right on track. The key is this: if you do start to get off the line, that don't let it get too far out of control. So that's why you need to go nice and slow. Use a really small stitch length. All right, and now I'm heading back in the other direction. Gonna increase my speed just a bit. Okay, and so now I'm gonna sew all the way around the curve here. Slow it down just a little bit. Okay, and now we're done. So we'll lift our needle, lift our presser foot, and we are done. I don't know how well you can see it, but this half I've been perfectly on the line. This one I got just slightly outside of the line, which is okay. It's still nice and curved. It's barely off the line, so it's not gonna mess too much with my seam allowance. So this is great. What you will do in class is after you have done this one and after you have done this one, you'll bring them both up to me and I'll check them over to see if they look okay. If they are really poorly done, then I'll show you what to do and maybe have you redo it, okay? After you've done both your inner curve and your outer curve paper sample, you'll bring it up to the instructor and have approval for both of them. Once you have approval on both of these, then you may go on to sew your actual project. So I've got my machine threaded, and I'm using a stitch length of 1, a stitch selector of stitch 1, stitch length of 2.5, so it's just a pretty standard setup. I'm going to be using the edge of my presser foot as the guide for my seam allowance, so it'll be somewhere between 3/8 and 4/8 of the seam allowance. And I'm going to start at the bottom set of my double pins. Okay. So I want to make sure that I back stitch where I start. I'm just going to stitch forward a few stitches, reverse again to the end. Okay. Now this bottom point of the heart is more like a pivot than it is a curve. So I'm going to go ahead and lift my needle. I need to go one more stitch. So I'm going to use my hand wheel to go one more stitch. And now I'm going to head this way. Again, using the edge of my presser foot as a guide. Now I always like to take my pins out before I get to them so I don't bump them. What happens sometimes if you run into your pins, it'll knock the needle, maybe not break it, but it'll knock it, and then it can mess up the look of your seam. So I'm just going to start curving around this outer curve here. This isn't too deep of a curve, it's pretty wide, so it makes it really easy to go around. Okay, so I'm just going to keep using that edge of my presser foot. I'm watching it the whole time to make sure that my edge of my fabric is lined up with the outside edge of the presser foot. Just helps keep the seam allowance consistent all the way around, keeps it nice and straight. Okay, another pin to take out. And I always put my pins right in the pin cushion. That's what I'd like you guys to do in class. It's just so much safer having your pins right in your pin cushion rather than just throwing them on your table or throwing them on the machine. That can be really dangerous for you and for the machine. It can hurt it. So here I'm coming across an inner curve. So I'm going to just go around this. Just nice and easy. I felt like I had a pretty good control there, but I can lower my stitch length a little bit. I lowered it down to a 1.8. There we go. And now I rounded the curve and I'm done with it. And increase back to a 2.5. Just now watch the edge of my presser foot. Okay. And you would just continue on until you get to the set of double pins where you will back stitch. All right, I'm done sewing. I've got this nice even seam all the way around. You'll see the way the inner curve kind of dips down at the top of the heart. And so now I am ready to finish off my seam by doing a process called clipping and notching. And for that I'm going to go back to my paper samples. So I'll start with my inner curved sample. And again, you need your regular scissors for paper. This is an inner curve, and on an inner curve you're going to cut slits straight to the seam. I'm not going to cut through the seam, but I'm just cutting straight from the edge of the seam up to the sewn stitching, about a 1/2 inch apart. Okay, and what this does, this allows some flexibility in your seam so it can kind of move and shape. So you'll really want that, especially on those letters that have several inner curves. You really need to do this part, okay? So we've clipped, that's just a straight cut into the inner curve. And then on an outer curve, like we have right down here, this is an outer curve, you are going to what is called notch. So I'm going to take my scissors, I'm going toward the seam, and I'm going to cut out a triangular shape piece. I'll leave about a 1/2 inch space, and then I'll do the same thing, cut a triangular piece up toward the seam. I want to get close to the seam, but I don't want to cut through it. Okay, this reduces the amount of bulkiness that you have in your seam, and just again allows for flexibility and movement in the curved seam. So I'm going to do the practice on this paper. I still need to do over here on this side, and then you'll also want to do a practice on this one. This is an outer curve, so you'll only be notching on this one. You'll go get teacher approval first, and then once you have teacher approval, then you may begin doing the clipping and notching on your actual project, okay? Alright, so sometimes when you're clipping and notching, you accidentally cut through the seam, and I'm going to show you what to do to repair that. This happens a lot. It's not something you want to do, but if you do it, it is repairable, but you need to repair it now. You need to repair it before you flip it inside out. So we're going to head over to the sewing machine so you can see what to do to fix it. So I've got my sewing machine ready to go. I've located the spot of the accident here where we cut through the seam. I'm going to begin sewing prior to that point. So here's where my actual break is in stitching. I'm going to start sewing back behind that a little bit. I'm going to line my needle back up with the existing seam, the one that's already there. Okay. But this time, oops. Okay. I need to stitch out a little bit, so I'm going to change my seam allowance just a tiny bit so that I go out past the cut part. There we go. And then I'm going to curve around again to meet back up with my seam that had previously been there. Okay, so now I have reinforced that area that I cut through. Let me show you what that looks like. So right here I had cut through it right here, and now I have a new seam just underneath it that's going to secure that spot. Alright, at this point, so I've done my clipping on my inner curve. I showed you how to repair that if you make a mistake. Same thing if you cut through a seam when you're doing your notching, you would repair it in the same way. Please make sure to look over your finished product carefully at this point to make sure you haven't cut through the seam anywhere, and if you have, that you repair it. It's so much easier to repair it at this stage than it would be if you flip it inside out, so make sure you do that now. So I've got all my clipping and my notching done. I'm going to take my samples that I did earlier, those 2 paper samples. Those had my name on them and my machine or my tray number. So I'm going to take those. I'm going to fold my project in half, and those 2 paper samples, I'm going to pin them all together and turn it in just like that. So turn it in, and then the way that this is graded, I'll grade the project this way where I can see your seam and your clipping and your notching. Then next class you'll flip it inside out, you'll press it really well, you'll stuff it and hand sew it, and I'll grade that as a separate part.